So I have one last question before we end today, Andrew. When we were talking about the definition of shamanism that I presented to you, you said one of the issues that you had with it is it didn't really like acknowledge the individual's ego and what they bring into the astral realm and how they do their practice. And that's always been an interesting concept to me because I've read about like indigenous shamans, some of them, going way back in time, that they had big egos. They would fight and they were prone to jealousies and territorialism, and they engaged in a lot of sorcery. And here we are, in this modern sort of spiritual culture that's trying, with these Eckhart Tolles and this kind of overtone of people trying to like get rid of the ego, transcend the ego. The ego's bad, and so there's this odd mix, and there's a lot of like external pressure, I think, from the larger spiritual community about that. And it's an interesting kind of concept for me to hold that. And I'm wondering, because I know that you are someone that holds the ego to be a very valuable aspect of the shamanic work. And so can you talk a little bit about that more, maybe?
Well, this is where our own, let's see, one of the kind of gifts of the school is this idea that we as modern Westerners actually have a lineage of ancestral shamanic wisdom in the form of alchemy. Mm-hmm. People are like, oh, what does alchemy have to do with shamanism? Well, it's actually this shamanic impulse that has evolved in Western civilization through hundreds and like centuries and centuries. It's the shamanic impulse. And so if we take an alchemical approach to the ego, we have a solution to the problem. Because, the ego can become diabolically inflated, especially with shamans working with sorcerous magic. The spirits kind of get in there and flavor how the ego develops, and the ego can even become diabolical and become a terrible weapon and do a lot of damage. But at the same time, if we try to like get rid of the ego, then like we're either living in complete denial of the fact that our ego is real and we're meant to have an ego, and it's actually God's gift to us to have an individuality, and we're supposed to cultivate it. So we live in a kind of denial and a twisted shame about our own individuality. Or like we surrender too much of our ego and we can get possessed. Mm. So the key, the solution is to transmute our ego, is to spiritualize it so that it can become raised to a higher spiritual quality, so that it's humble, so that it's generous, so that it's kind and loving, and humble is a big part of it. Mm-hmm. Most people get into trouble through the lack of humility because the ego is not inherently humble. The alchemy is very much going against the grain. The transmutational work that we have to do is against our natural inclinations. It's like swimming upstream in many ways. It's like same thing with dealing with our sexual energy. It's working alchemically with our sexual energy is like going against the grain, going against the flow. It's natural to for it to flow that direction, we have to bottle it. Mm-hmm. And that leads to some suffering and tension. But that suffering and tension is the pressure cooker that leads to the transmutation. It's the same thing with the sexual energy as with the ego. You have to bottle it, contain it, and transform it so that it can be an effective vehicle. Because it's our ego that is ultimately responsible for incarnating our higher self. Mm-hmm. Our ego is what makes our higher self manifested in the actual physical world. Mm-hmm. To the extent that we can work consciously out of our higher self, that has to happen through our ego. So our ego has to be transformed into a vehicle for this higher level of work that we're called to do as shamanic individuals. Mm-hmm. So it's about this means a lot of dismemberments and reforging. Dismemberments and reforging, getting smacked down, humbling yourself, and then readjusting. Mm-hmm. So because the ego is naturally prone to inflation, especially when it's working with in shamanic realms, it's working with archetypal powers, there's a natural tendency to inflate, and that naturally leads to suffering and smackdowns. So the alchemical process is a dramatic one. There's lots of big inflations followed by big deflations, which can lead to depressions and discouragement and stuff. But through this cyclical process, our ego is gradually being equalized or balanced out, so that it can actually still hold our divine I am spark and be our conscious I am, and give us the driver's seat for which we can do our shamanic work. And so that's the ideal that I hold, and that's in keeping with the Western ancestral shamanic wisdom that we have, kind of buried away in the alchemical tradition. So that's what I'm trying to make more accessible to Western seekers who are awakening and having legitimate shamanic initiatory awakenings, and they are looking for guidance.